Well, we could have a separate debate on that, but what I'd really like to do is turn to the audience. We've talked about fundamental change, drivers of change, some values that I think would be true 10 or 20 years ago are still true today. We've talked about new models to involve and encourage change in education, and we've talked about the way in which business can and should have an active voice, and then what happens when educated people get to business. We'd really like to open the floor for your questions and your comment. I'd appreciate it if you would wave your hand if you'd like to ask one. We're going to start there, and would you be sure to tell us your name and where you're from, and if you'd like to direct the question to a particular panelist, I know we'd all welcome that. So please, where are you from?
I'm from South Africa. I'm Vuisa Tanga from Cape Peninsula University of Technology, Vice Chancellor. My question is to Paul.
Are you a parent also?
I'm everything.
A good characteristic of leadership.
Paul is concerned about the position of men in terms of empowerment in South Africa. What would you regard as empowerment, Paul, as women empowerment in the context of the control of the economy of the country, in terms of only 10% of women or less than 10% being in the corporate as women, even less for black women? What is your concern? Thank you.
Shall I go?
Yes.
I was speaking purely from a school education perspective. I'm not a business person, and I must say that my comment was a little bit in jest, not very serious. But as far as education in South Africa is concerned, and even higher education, the sector in which you're involved, we see more enrollment and more qualifiers in terms of being women compared to men. We're seeing that women are taking education more seriously than the men are doing. What happens outside or after the school is beyond our control. So I would not like to express myself on exactly what's happening, but she's absolutely right, and that is that in that sector we still have huge challenges, and that's where the collaboration with the school environment comes in.
Just to clarify, we have a Twitter question about, is there a quality or characteristic of leadership in a developing country that's really different than in a developed country? I wonder how each of the panelists feel about that. Is there a difference by stage of development? Paul, then Josephine, then Wayne.
I think one thing I think is, it's a roundabout way to answer this question, but I think very much in the developing world and increasingly in the developed world, there's a kind of new development model emerging. That development model is known as the social innovation movement, or however you want to call it, but it's really a decentralized model rather than the old model of big companies, concentrated energy, shipping stuff all around the world. You know, India, China, other countries are showing us that there are alternatives, and we're actually importing this idea of decentralizing production and consumption and involving communities and stakeholders in rethinking the production model and rethinking lifestyles. And that's a leadership that isn't in a person or isn't in, but it's a model. It's a model of showing that there could be another way of development which allows you to have more control over your human destiny, and in itself is an empowering model. Because the size and big corrupts, and very big absolutely corrupts, and we've seen this with the banks, etc. If we can and so we look at the world and we see all over experiments bottom up of people wanting to retake a human dimension, have more control over their destiny, and collectively as stakeholders, often supported in different ways, possibly with certain skills, etc., to start to build up their communities as an economic and social unit. And this, I think, is a model of a new leadership that will emerge and throw up new leaders.
Wayne or Paul, difference between advanced and developing countries?
You know, the one thing we see more and more, Alan, in developing countries is this natural, innate entrepreneurial spirit that you don't get to the same extent in the US or indeed in Western Europe. And that's incredibly exciting. It's contagious. It's almost intoxicating. But the challenge for us as employers then is, how are we equipping these people to grow faster than ever before? Because if you did grow up in a developed economy country, then you grew in a pretty structured and stable way. And the pace of growth in developing countries is so fast that we're having to now develop employees and leaders faster than ever before. And so how do you take advantage of that optimism, that belief, the belief in purpose, whilst also ensuring that people are growing to be pragmatic, to be balanced, etc. And again, I connect that back to some of the traits that we see in women as leaders. And it's dangerous to generalize, I know that, but in general, as we look at our employees, we tend to see men that are developing and they're wanting to grow, they want to take control, they're driven by financial metrics, they're driven by their perception of success. Women tend to be more motivated by collaborative leadership, by making a difference, and sometimes the non-material things. And so, how do you connect those two? And that's one of the challenges for both business and indeed for education as we look forward. And so...
And
yes,
everywhere.
Absolutely, Alan. And so as we look at developing talent, whether it be in Asia, the Middle East, or in Africa, we see massive potential, but clearly not a great deal of depth. And so we have to figure out, how do we work together to prepare these people so that they're fit for the future? And I think that's a real challenge both for business and for education.
And Alan, can I just add very quickly, building on that I think also when the Twitter person is asking about are there examples of leadership, new leaders, the problem is that our society has very much given attention to one intelligence. We have 10 intelligences, if you look at Howard Gardner's research. And that goes from the rational, logical, linear, which is the one we have tended to give most attention to and is the one that exists in most of our institutions. But there's kinesthetic, body, there's creativity, there's interpersonal and intrapersonal. And so, in a way, until we really dig into diversity and accept that there's also such a broad range of intelligences that includes the rational and the non-rational, the emotional, the spiritual, etc., it's hard to allow people with these qualities to emerge as leaders because society doesn't proclaim it as a valuable resource.
Yeah, I'd like to link up with what Wayne has said about, I don't really see a difference in model necessarily. It's more that we see, as far as I can see, that in the developing and emerging countries, we're seeing a stronger drive by the society, by non-governmental organizations, getting involved in leadership and directing matters where governments seem to fail to take the necessary lead in the development of the people of the countries.
And an important driver of change. Can I take a question, the lady in the red jacket, and then we'll go to the gentleman from Thailand. Yes.
I'm Gülsün Sağlamer from Istanbul Technical University. I believe that there is a big difference between the developed, advanced countries and developing countries in terms of level of uncertainties where the decisions are taken. So it puts a lot of pressure on the leadership in the developing countries where uncertainties are very high. So it creates differences in the style, in the decision-making processes of the leaders in the developing countries, I believe. That's a comment, not a question.
There's a good response to that, and that is...
I think we'd like a good response.
Okay, here it is.
And then...
I think what's interesting is that the future is always going to be about uncertainty more and more, because many of our leaders come from a world that we thought was predictable and linear. But with the complexity now, we will be in a permanent state of unpredictability, emergence, and uncertainty. So those very values that may you find be difficult may be the values we are going to need of being able to lead and manage in uncertainty, because that's the new reality. So
These leaders will be more experienced in the future.
yeah,
That's what you're saying.
that's exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
And as Paul is suggesting, that social dynamics and rate of change are so fast in some situations that in the advanced countries, you're not going to get that experience. A question from Thailand. And then I see a question in the middle in the back there, if the microphone will start up that way.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. My name is Ninat Olanwarut, Secretary General of the Association of Southeast Asian Institutions of Higher Learning. I think there is a difference between the developing and developing countries, definitely. I usually work with many vice chancellor, rector, and president in the region, and we are excusing one country. I don't want to mention the name of the country, that being very autocratic. So no, they're not very autocratic. They're very pragmatic. See, the thing is, in South Asia especially, we are using very centralized system, whereas the West are more decentralized. We heard the word empowerment for so long, and yet we wait to see the leaders with what you're talking about, collaborative leadership, or passionate. And again, I mean, we have to learn to cope with the new generation now, because the students now, they are very computer. I took computer in 1965, and now I'm computer illiterate. And how can we cope? How can we keep up with the students who can learn on their own? They can Google, they can learn on their own. We are still very slow. We cannot keep up with them. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Please, and are parents actually the source of stability in this age of change?
Well, I'd like to react to 2 points. The first one is the concept of empowerment. I think a good leader would recognize that people have power. You don't need to empower them. All you need to do is recognize the fact that people have power and that you should unleash that power as a leader. As far as the technology is concerned and the ICT revolution, yes, it's true that I learned from my children how to use Google and all the technological miracles that are happening around us. But the point is, my role remains as a parent to teach my child and to lead my child and to be a role model for my child in using the technology responsibly, with credibility, with honesty, and all of those values. My role as a stabilizing factor as a parent in my child's upbringing and in my child's use of and confrontation of all the changes taking place, I think has in fact increased.